Following Jesus these days isn't easy, and it wasn't easy earlier in human history either. You see, each host culture has always had friction against followers of God. For example, in the early church days, right after Jesus ascended into heaven, they had to contend with the host Roman culture of their day. From the outside, the Roman Empire looked like really religiously diverse. They loved other religions and accepted them into the Roman Empire, which is a new thing back then. Normally when empires would take over other empires, they would say, hey, you have to worship our gods. But Romans actually said, hey, we'll incorporate you into our pantheon of gods. One of the greatest philosophers of Roman times, Cicero, once said that, yet in the sense of religion, that is in the worship of the gods, we are far superior. Religion was really important in Roman life, and they actually had state-sponsored religious activities, things like cultic activities, public monuments and temples, religious ceremonies that everyone was invited to participate in. On the surface, this seems like, wow, what a great and free society, but this was all done for a purpose. The Romans knew that one of the biggest motivators of rebellion was religious freedom, and so they allowed anyone to worship whatever god they wanted as long as they had one allegiance first, which was Rome. The religious diversity wasn't for the sake of having more gods or thinking they were true. Really, the religious diversity was for the sake of public order and ensuring that there is a hierarchy. A wide variety of religious beliefs were totally accepted as long as they served the interests of the Roman Empire first. As a historian says, in short, Rome tolerated religious diversity as long as the real religion of Rome was honored, which was Rome itself. So why were Christians persecuted, especially in a religious open freedom kind of environment like Rome? It's because they wouldn't replace Jesus on the throne. It was Jesus no matter what. Let's remind ourselves of Daniel and his friends because they're actually in almost a very similar situation. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. See, Daniel and his friends wouldn't replace God on the throne either. And funnily enough, Babylon was very similar to the Roman Empire in the way that they kind of had a big religious diversity, which was very different back then as well. They assimilated different nations into their empire and would take the best and the brightest from each nation and incorporate them into Babylon society. And if you do this enough, obviously you'll begin to have different influences from different parts of the world. And so they're kind of open to different religious beliefs as long as you worshipped Babylon first. In this case, personified in King Nebuchadnezzar. You see, for each empire, for Babylon and for Rome, each had religious diversity, but you had to worship the empire first if you want to have your religion or your god of choice. You can worship whatever you want, just don't forget your first allegiance. God followers just wouldn't replace God on the throne. It doesn't matter what anyone would say or do, they would not stop God from being on the throne, and that's why they pose a threat to the social order of the empire. Another reason that Christians and those who followed God were really threatening to Rome and Babylon is because they passed implicit judgment just by existing. You see, Daniel and his friends abstained from practices that the Babylonian Empire would say they have to do. They would abstain from those, even differing themselves from Jews who had come with them over to Babylon because they wanted to stay faithful to God. Christians in Rome stayed faithful to Jesus despite social exclusion and harm coming their way, and even death, and brutal death at that. Historian Stephen Benko comments on this in the early church. The Romans tolerated a remarkable degree of religious liberty, and they therefore found the Christians' exclusive claims to truth disconcerting. You see, not only did Christians pass implicit judgment on those around them, but the big reason that they did so just by existing is because they claimed to know the truth. Pagans assumed that religious truth by nature was ambiguous and kind of gray, and so you had to debate about it, but you couldn't really know for certain. And that sounds really familiar for our day, doesn't it? Christians thought otherwise. Christians were sure that God came to earth as Jesus in order that humanity would have salvation, because all other attempts to reach God had failed. Benko comments on this as well, and he says, "The Christian, however, was convinced that he was in possession of the truth because Jesus Christ embodied the ultimate revelation about God." Last week we talked about ego shock, the phenomenon that when you're socially rejected, your brain treats it like you're actually being physically harmed. And we can see the environment that Babylon and Rome created, that you would be immediately excluded if you believed that God was the way to life, because religious truth wasn't really a thing. It was supposed to be ambiguous so everyone could get along, and you're supposed to worship the empire you belong to firstly, which was either Babylon or Rome. I would say we actually live in a very similar time. While we might not live in an empire like Babylon or Rome, culture asks us to worship something before Jesus as well. In Babylon, it was the King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylon Empire. In Rome, it was the emperor and Rome itself. Today, it's the authentic self. We're going to be talking about that next week and how all this history lesson applies to us and how we can be faithful followers of Jesus in a culture that wants to reject us. See you soon.